Airport, staff kicked. John Kennedy, wife, but regretted everything. When John arrived, Elizabeth Kennedy moved through the crowded airport terminal with a quiet urgency, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The hum of early morning travelers surrounded her, businessmen in pressed suits, families dragging oversized suitcases, and college students with earbuds dangling from their necks. She adjusted the strap of her carry-on bag, the weight of it digging into her shoulder. She was exhausted, her body running on little more than adrenaline and a lukewarm coffee she'd grabbed from a kiosk near the entrance. The past few weeks had been a blur of commitments, charity events in New Orleans, a community meeting in Shreveport, and a last-minute speaking engagement in Houston. Her suitcase hadn't been unpacked in days, the contents a jumbled mix of blouses, toiletries, and paperwork she hadn't had time to organize. But today wasn't about schedules or speeches. Today was personal. Elizabeth was headed to Baton Rouge for a family gathering, a milestone celebration for her niece's graduation from LSU. It was the kind of event she'd promised not to miss no matter how packed her calendar had become. Her flight was set to board in less than an hour, and she needed to move quickly. The Southwest Airlines check-in counter loomed ahead, a bright blue sign glowing under the fluorescent lights. Elizabeth approached the desk, her phone already open to her boarding pass. She wore a simple navy dress with a light cardigan, her hair pulled back in a neat bun. Despite the fatigue etched into her face, she carried herself with a calm professionalism, the kind honed from years of navigating high-pressure situations. She set her carry-on bag down and slid her phone across the counter to the young man behind the desk. His name tag read Tyler, and he barely looked up from his screen as he took her phone. "I'm on flight 1423 to Baton Rouge," Elizabeth said, her voice steady but clipped. "I'd like to check my carry-on." Tyler tapped a few keys, his fingers moving lazily across the keyboard. Then he frowned, his brow furrowing as he stared at the monitor. "Huh," he muttered, almost to himself. "You're not in the system." Elizabeth blinked, her grip tightening on her coffee cup. "That can't be right," she said, keeping her tone even. "I checked in online 2 hours ago. The boarding pass is right there." She nodded toward her phone, which still displayed the QR code for her flight. Tyler glanced at the screen, then back at his monitor, his expression unreadable. "Well, there's been a change," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Your seat's been reassigned. You'll have to wait." Elizabeth's heart gave a quick thud, but she didn't let it show. Reassigned to what she asked, her voice still calm, but now carrying a slight edge. Tyler didn't answer right away. Instead, he waved to another employee behind the counter, a woman with a tight ponytail and a lanyard swinging from her neck. "Hey, can you take a look at this?" He called, his tone casual, as if Elizabeth's question was an inconvenience. The woman, whose name tag read Sarah, walked over and glanced at the screen. "She's flagged for random review," Sarah said flatly, barely looking at Elizabeth. "We need to recheck your credentials." Elizabeth's jaw tightened, but she kept her composure. "Excuse me," she said, her words measured. "I've flown this route multiple times this year. This has never happened." Sarah shrugged her eyes, already drifting back to the screen. "It's routine," she said, her tone dismissive. "We just need to verify some things." Elizabeth felt a sharp pang in her chest, a mix of frustration and disbelief. "This isn't routine," she said, her voice firm but not raised. "I've shown you my boarding pass and ID. What's the issue?" Tyler leaned forward now, his earlier nonchalance replaced by a slight smirk. "Ma'am, if you don't calm down, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," he said, his words laced with a condescension that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. She raised an eyebrow, her gaze locking onto his. "Calm down," she repeated. "I'm asking a question. That's all." Tyler stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. "Please, "Stand over there," he said, pointing to a spot near the end of the counter. The passengers in line behind her began to notice their eyes darting between Elizabeth and the counter. A few whispered to each other, and one man pulled out his phone, subtly angling it toward the scene. Elizabeth stepped aside, her arms crossing tightly over her chest. She wasn't about to give Tyler the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Her government ID was still in her hand, the official seal glinting under the terminal lights. "I'm not hiding anything," she said, holding up the badge. "This is an official trip. Can someone explain what's going on?" Sarah glanced at the ID, but didn't take it. "ID doesn't override protocol," she said, her voice cold. Elizabeth felt a sinking sensation in her gut. This wasn't a simple mix-up. There was something deliberate in the way they were treating her, something that felt personal. Still, she kept her voice level. "I'd like to speak to a supervisor," she said, her eyes never leaving Sarah's. Tyler, now standing near the edge of the counter, muttered something under his breath and motioned to someone out of view. "Security, please," he said into his radio, his tone sharp. The word security hit Elizabeth like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She stood still, her eyes fixed on a small scuff mark on the floor, her meat racing. She hadn't raised her voice, hadn't broken any rules, and yet here she was being treated like a problem for simply asking why her seat had been changed. The other passengers were openly watching now, some with sympathy, others with curiosity. A woman in a red coat made eye contact with Elizabeth and shook her head slightly as if to say, "This isn't right." Elizabeth gave her a small nod, but her focus was on the clock above the counter. It was ticking closer to boarding time, and she could feel the minutes slipping away. Her niece's graduation party was waiting, the kind of moment she'd promised to be there for. She thought of her sister, who had texted her earlier with details about where to sit, and her niece, who had called her Aunt Liz since she was a toddler. Missing this wasn't an option, but it was starting to feel inevitable. Two TSA officers approached, their boots heavy against the floor. They moved with a deliberate pace, not rushed, but not relaxed either. "Ma'am, we need you to come with us," one of them said, his voice flat. Elizabeth didn't move right away. For what she asked, her tone clear and controlled. "Random review," the officer replied. "Please don't make this more difficult than it has to be." Elizabeth held out her boarding pass and ID again, her hands steady. "I've already checked in," she said. "This is an official trip. That's a real badge. There's no issue here except the one you're creating." The officer didn't even glance at the ID. "Ma'am, please," he said, his voice firmer now. "We're not asking." Elizabeth's eyes flicked to the gate screen. Flight 11423 was still on time, but boarding was starting soon. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a deep breath, and then followed the officers. They led her through a side door near the edge of the terminal, away from the crowd. The hallway was narrow and quiet, the fluorescent lights casting a harsh glow on the linoleum floor. A third TSA agent met them halfway, whispering something to the officers that Elizabeth couldn't hear. They stopped in a small room with a metal table and a few chairs. "We'll need to do a full pat-down," one of the officers said. "Your bag will be rescreened." Elizabeth's voice was soft but sharp. "No warrant, no probable cause, no explanation," she said. "You're crossing a line you're not trained to handle." The officer didn't respond, just motioned for her to raise her arms. Elizabeth complied, standing with her arms outstretched as they patted her down with mechanical precision. Her bag was opened, her belongings pulled out, her makeup case, a folded scarf, a few folders with notes for the trip. No one explained anything. Minutes dragged by, each one heavier than the last. Elizabeth broke the silence. "Can someone tell me why my seat was reassigned?" she asked, her voice steady, but carrying a quiet force. One of the officers glanced up from her bag. "Ma'am, I don't handle seating," he said. "That's the airline's job. We were called because you were being difficult." Elizabeth's breath caught, but she didn't let her composure slip. "Difficult?" she repeated. "I asked a question. I didn't yell. I didn't resist. I've done everything you've asked." The officer shrugged, his eyes already back on her bag. "We respond to what we're told," he said. "That's our job." Elizabeth looked at her watch. The boarding time had passed. Her flight was likely already taxiing down the runway. She sat down in one of the metal chairs, her hands resting on her knees, her gaze fixed on the wall. She wasn't just missing a flight now. She was missing a promise, a moment she couldn't get back. And for what? For asking a question. For existing in a space where someone decided she didn't belong. The TSA officers stepped back, one of them murmuring into his radio. The other stood near the door, avoiding her gaze. Elizabeth's phone was still in her hand, and she typed a quick message to her husband, John Kennedy. "I was pulled. Missed the flight. I need you here." She hit send and waited, her fingers curled tightly around the phone. She didn't know what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain: the man who would walk through that door wouldn't let this slide. John Kennedy wasn't the type to stay quiet when someone he loved was treated like this. And as she sat there, the weight of the moment settling over her, Elizabeth felt a quiet resolve. She hadn't done anything wrong, and she wasn't going to let them make her feel like she had. The room was silent, but outside the terminal was buzzing. Passengers were talking, phones were recording, and a story was starting to take shape, one that would soon be bigger than this small, cold room. Elizabeth Kennedy sat in the stark, fluorescent-lit room, her hands folded tightly in her lap. The metal chair was cold against her back, and the faint hum of the air conditioning filled the silence. Her carry-on bag lay open on the table, its contents, her scarf, a small notebook, a bottle of hand lotion, scattered carelessly by the TSA officers who had rifled through it. The officers themselves stood a few feet away, one checking his radio, the other staring at the floor, as if it might offer an escape from the tension in the room. Elizabeth's phone rested on her knee, the screen still glowing from the message she'd sent to her husband, John Kennedy. "I was pulled. Missed the flight. I need you here." She hadn't expected this, not today, not when all she wanted was to board a flight to Baton Rouge for her niece's graduation celebration. But here she was, detained for no clear reason, treated like a problem for asking why her seat had been reassigned. Her jaw was set, her eyes fixed on a crack in the wall. She wasn't angry, not yet. It was something deeper, a quiet burn of indignation that came from knowing this wasn't just a mistake. It was personal, and she wasn't about to let it break her. Outside, the terminal buzzed with the usual chaos of morning travel, but a different kind of energy was building near the Southwest Airlines check-in counter. Passengers who had witnessed the earlier exchange were talking, their voices low but urgent. A young woman in a denim jacket tapped furiously on her phone, uploading a short video of Elizabeth being escorted away by TSA officers. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to her friend, who nodded in agreement. An older man with a briefcase shook his head, whispering to his wife, "That's not how you treat someone, especially not her." The whispers were spreading, and with them a sense that something wrong had happened at Gate 12B. Elizabeth didn't know it yet, but her story was already starting to ripple beyond the confines of the airport. John Kennedy was just a few miles away when he received Elizabeth's message. He was in the back of a black SUV heading to a meeting in downtown Dallas, his briefcase open on the seat beside him. The text lit up his phone, and he read it twice, his brow furrowing. Elizabeth wasn't one to overreact. If she said she needed him, something was seriously wrong. He leaned forward and tapped the driver on the shoulder. "Change of plans," he said, his Louisiana drawl steady but firm. "Take me to Love Field. Now." The driver nodded, merging into the next lane, without a word. John's fingers hovered over his phone, tempted to call Elizabeth, but he decided against it. She'd tell him everything when he got there. For now, he needed to focus. He adjusted his tie, his mind already working through what he might be walking into. John Kennedy wasn't a man who raised his voice often, but he had a way of commanding a room without trying. 30 years in public service had taught him that authority didn't come from shouting, it came from knowing exactly what to say and when to say it. Back in the terminal, Elizabeth remained seated, her composure unshaken, despite the absurdity of the situation. The TSA officers had stopped searching her bag, but no one had explained why she was still there. The door to the room opened, and Tyler, the young gate agent who had first dismissed her, poked his head in. He avoided her gaze, muttering something to the officers before retreating. Elizabeth caught the word supervisor and felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that this wasn't over yet. She glanced at her watch. Her flight had long since left the gate, and with it her chance to make it to Baton Rouge on time. She thought of her niece, who had texted her a photo of her graduation cap just yesterday, and her sister, who was probably wondering why she hadn't heard from her. The weight of missing that moment settled over her, but she pushed it down. There would be time to deal with that later. Right now, she needed to stay focused. The automatic doors of the terminal slid open, and John Kennedy stepped inside his dark coat, catching the light as he moved. He carried himself with a measured confidence, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of his wife. His maroon scarf, a gift from Elizabeth, was draped loosely around his neck, and his polished shoes clicked against the floor with purpose. A few travelers glanced his way, recognizing the familiar face of Louisiana's senior senator, but John didn't notice. His focus was singular. He approached the southwest counter, where Sarah, the second gate agent, was now stationed. She looked up, her expression shifting from boredom to unease, as she registered who was standing in front of her. "I'm looking for my wife, Elizabeth Kennedy." John said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight. "She was detained here. I want to know why." Sarah hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. Sir, I'd need to check with John," cut her off, not rudely, but firmly. "You don't need to check with anyone. You were here. You saw what happened. Where is she?" Sarah's eyes darted to the side where Tyler was now pretending to organize paperwork. "She's with TSA." Sarah said, her voice quieter now. It was a random review. John's gaze didn't waver. "Random," he repeated the word laced with skepticism. "My wife showed you her ID, her boarding pass, and asked a simple question about her seat. And now she's missing her flight. That's not random. That's a problem. Get me your supervisor." Sarah nodded quickly, picking up her radio with shaky hands. "Yes, sir. One moment." John turned slightly, his eyes catching the crowd that had begun to gather near the counter. A few passengers were filming their phones, held discreetly at their sides. He didn't acknowledge them, but he knew what this could become. He'd seen it before, moments that started small, but grew into something much larger. His focus shifted back to the counter as a supervisor, a middle-aged man with a clipboard and a nervous smile, approached. "Senator Kennedy," the supervisor said, extending a hand. "I'm Mark, the gate manager." "I'm so sorry for any inconvenience." John didn't take the hand. "I'm not here for apologies," he said. "I'm here for my wife. Where is she, and why was she detained?" Mark's smile faltered. "It was a standard procedure, sir." Her seat was reassigned, and she was flagged for a security review. "It's protocol." John leaned in just enough to close the space between them. "Protocol," he said, his voice low but sharp. "You ignored her credentials, escalated a non-issue to security, and now she's missed a family event. That's not protocol. That's a failure. Take me to her." Mark nodded clearly out of his depth and gestured toward the side door where Elizabeth had been taken. John followed his steps, deliberate, his presence drawing more eyes from the crowd. The passengers were no longer just whispering, they were posting, tweeting, sharing. One woman, a teacher from Austin, typed out a quick caption, "Senator Kennedy just showed up for his wife." This is about to get real. Inside the small room, Elizabeth looked up as the door opened. John stepped in, his eyes immediately finding hers. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer, now meant only for her. She nodded once, a small gesture that carried more weight than words. "I'm fine," she said, but the tightness in her voice told him everything he needed to know. He turned to the TSA officers who had straightened up at his arrival. "Who's in charge here?" he asked, his tone calm but unyielding. The lead officer, a man with a buzz cut and a badge that read Carter, stepped forward. "Sir, I'm Officer Carter." This was a routine. John held up a hand. "Don't tell me it's routine. My wife asked why her seat was changed. She showed her ID. You detained her without cause. I want names and an explanation." Carter blinked, clearly unprepared for this level of scrutiny. "We were following orders, sir," he said. "The airline flagged her for review." John's eyes narrowed. "The airline," he repeated. "Then let's go back to the counter." He turned to Elizabeth, offering her his hand. She stood, smoothing her dress, her bag still half-zipped on the table. She didn't bother repacking it, she'd deal with that later. Together, they walked back into the terminal, the TSA officers trailing behind like reluctant shadows. The crowd parted as they approached the counter where Tyler and Sarah were now joined by Mark, the supervisor. Tyler's face paled when he saw John, and he busied himself with a stack of papers, avoiding eye contact. John stopped in front of the counter, his presence filling the space. "You," he said, pointing to Tyler. "What was your reason for calling security?" Tyler swallowed, his voice barely audible. "She wouldn't stand down, sir. She kept asking questions." John's expression didn't change. "She asked why her seat was changed," he said. "Did she shout?" Tyler shook his head. "No." "Did she threaten anyone?" Another shake. "No." John leaned in slightly. "So you called security because she asked a question. You do realize that's not how this works, don't you?" Tyler didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the counter. John turned to Mark. "Your staff turned a simple inquiry into a security incident. That's not just bad service, that's targeted escalation. And I want to know why." Mark opened his mouth, then closed it clearly, scrambling for words. "Senator, we're reviewing the situation," he said. "We'll make this right." John shook his head. "This isn't about making it right. This is about doing your job. My wife shouldn't have to prove she belongs on a flight she paid for." Elizabeth stood beside him, her arms crossed, her silence deliberate. She wasn't here to soften the moment, she was letting John's words do the work. The crowd was growing, phones still recording, and the air was thick with anticipation. This wasn't just about one gate anymore. It was about something bigger, something everyone in that terminal could feel. And as John stood there, unflinching, the story was already leaving the airport, ready to spark a conversation no one could ignore. The terminal at Dallas Love Field buzzed with a restless energy as John and Elizabeth Kennedy walked away from the Southwest Airlines counter, their steps measured but resolute. The crowd parted silently, eyes following them, some with quiet admiration, others with phones still raised, capturing every moment. The confrontation at Gate 12B had ended, but its echoes were just beginning to spread. Elizabeth adjusted the strap of her disheveled carry-on bag, her navy dress slightly wrinkled from the ordeal. She hadn't spoken much during John's exchange with the gate staff, but her presence had been a force of its own, calm, unyielding, a reminder that she wasn't just a passenger, but a person who deserved better. John, his maroon scarf still draped neatly over his coat, kept his hand lightly on her elbow, a subtle gesture of support as they moved toward the terminal exit. Behind them, the gate agents and TSA officers stood in a huddle, their faces a mix of unease and defensiveness. Tyler, the young agent who had sparked the incident, had slipped away to a back office, his name tag now tucked into his pocket. The supervisor, Mark, clutched his clipboard like a shield, already mentally drafting the report he'd have to send to his regional manager. But no report could contain what was happening outside those walls. By the time John and Elizabeth reached the parking lot, the videos were already online. A shaky 30-second clip, uploaded by a college student named Mia, showed Elizabeth being escorted out of the gate area, her head high, her expression composed, despite the two TSA officers flanking her. The caption read, "This is how they treat people at Love Field." She didn't do anything wrong. Another video posted by a businessman in a hurry to catch his own flight captured John Kennedy's arrival. His sharp questions, his unwavering tone, the way the gate agents seemed to shrink under his scrutiny. Senator Kennedy, standing up for his wife. "Respect," the caption declared. The posts were gaining traction, shared and retweeted by strangers who felt a spark of outrage or recognition. Comments poured in. "This happens all the time, just not to people with titles. I've been through this. No one listens unless you're somebody. Good for him for calling them out." The story was no longer confined to the terminal. It was a wildfire spreading across social media, picking up speed with every view. Elizabeth leaned against the side of their car in the parking lot, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the horizon where the Dallas skyline blurred into the morning haze. She hadn't checked her phone yet, but she could feel it vibrating in her bag, missed calls, texts, probably her sister wondering why she hadn't landed in Baton Rouge. John stood beside her, his coat unbuttoned now, his hands in his pockets. "They didn't expect you to be treated like that," he said, his voice low, the Louisiana drawl softening the edges of his words. Elizabeth gave a small nod, but her expression was distant. "They didn't expect anyone to care," she replied. The weight of the moment hung between them, not just the missed flight or the family event she'd now have to explain, but the deeper sting of being dismissed, of having to prove she belonged in a space she'd already earned. John glanced at her, his eyes searching her face. "You want me to call someone? Get this sorted." She shook her head. "Not yet. I just need a minute." Inside the terminal, the Southwest Airlines staff were scrambling. Mark had called his regional supervisor, a woman named Karen, who worked out of Houston. Her voice crackled through the phone, sharp and impatient. "You let this happen under your watch?" she asked. "Do you know who that was?" Mark stammered, "We didn't know at first, ma'am. It was a standard review." Karen cut him off. "Standard doesn't apply when you're detaining a senator's wife for no reason. Fix this, now." Mark hung up his face, pale, and turned to Sarah, who was still at the counter, pretending to reorganize boarding passes. "We need a statement," he said. "Something to get ahead of this." Sarah nodded, but her eyes darted to the break room where Tyler was hiding. "What about him?" she asked. Mark sighed. "He's done enough. Keep him out of sight." The airline's first attempt at damage control came an hour later. A brief post on their official social media account. "We regret any inconvenience caused to our passengers at Dallas Love Field today. We are reviewing our procedures to ensure all customers are treated with respect. It was carefully worded, vague enough to avoid admitting fault, but the internet wasn't having it. Replies flooded in some sarcastic inconvenience. You humiliated someone for asking a question. Others furious. This is why people hate flying. You treat us like criminals. A few users tagged news outlets, and by midday, local stations in Dallas were reaching out to Southwest for comment. The story was no longer just a viral moment, it was news, and it was growing. Elizabeth finally checked her phone as she and John sat in the car, the engine idling. Her sister had texted Liz, "Where are you? Everything okay?" A staffer from John's office had sent a message, "Ma'am, a reporter from WFAA wants to talk. Should I stall them?" There were others, friends, cousins, even a neighbor who had seen the videos online. Elizabeth scrolled through the notifications, her thumb pausing over a link someone had sent her. It was one of the videos now, with thousands of views. She hesitated, then pressed play. The footage was grainy, but it captured her clearly standing by the counter, her voice steady as she asked Tyler about her seat, then later walking with the TSA officers, her posture straight, her face unreadable. She turned the phone off and set it in her lap. "It's out there," she said quietly. John nodded, his hands resting on the steering wheel. "It was always going to be," he said. "You okay with that?" She didn't answer right away. "I didn't want this," she said finally. "I just wanted to get to Baton Rouge." The public's reaction was more than Elizabeth had expected. People weren't just angry, they were sharing their own stories, turning the incident into a mirror for their own experiences. A nurse from Fort Worth posted about being pulled aside for a random search that felt anything but random. A retired teacher from Austin described missing a flight after being questioned for carrying too many books in her bag. A veteran from San Antonio wrote, "I showed my military ID, and they still treated me like I was nobody." This hits home. The comments piled up, each one a thread in a larger tapestry of frustration and recognition. Elizabeth's story wasn't unique, and that was what made it resonate. It wasn't about her status as a senator's wife, it was about the quiet indignities so many faced, the moments when they were made to feel small for no reason at all. Southwest's regional office was now in full crisis mode. Karen, the supervisor, had flown in from Houston to meet with Mark and the gate staff. In a cramped conference room near the terminal, she laid into them. "You had one job: get passengers on their flights," she said, her voice tight. "Instead, you turned a simple question into a public relations nightmare." Mark tried to explain. "We followed protocol, ma'am." She was flagged. Karen held up a hand. "Protocol doesn't mean ignoring common sense. You saw her ID. You knew she wasn't a threat. And you still called security. Why?" No one had a good answer. Tyler, who had been summoned to the meeting, sat in the corner, his head down. "I thought she was being difficult," he mumbled. Karen's eyes narrowed. "Difficult?" She asked why her seat was changed. "That's not a crime. That's a customer." Tyler didn't respond, and the room fell silent. Outside, the story was taking on a life of its own. A Dallas morning show ran a segment titled "Trouble at Love Field Senator's Wife." Detained, featuring clips from the passenger videos and a brief interview with a travel expert who criticized the airline's handling of the situation. "This is a failure of training and accountability," the expert said. "Passengers deserve clarity, not escalation." By evening, the story had reached national outlets with headlines like "Southwest under fire after detaining senator's wife," and viral video sparks outrage over airport incident. Elizabeth and John, now at a hotel in Dallas, watched the coverage in silence. The TV in their room flickered with images of the terminal, the same counter where Elizabeth had stood just hours ago. "They're making it about you," Elizabeth said, her voice quiet. John shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about what they did to you." Elizabeth and John declined the airline's initial offer of a first-class seat on the next flight to Baton Rouge. "This isn't about a better seat," Elizabeth told the representative who called. "This is about treating people with respect." The representative apologized profusely, promising a full review. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in platitudes. She hung up her fingers, lingering on the phone. The apologies felt hollow, too little too late. What she wanted, what so many wanted, wasn't a voucher or an upgrade. It was the assurance that no one else would have to go through what she did, that a question wouldn't be met with suspicion, that a person's dignity wouldn't be stripped away because someone behind a counter had a bad day. As the day ended, the terminal grew quiet, but the story didn't. It lived on in the videos, the posts, the conversations. And for Elizabeth, it was a reminder that some moments, no matter how small they start, have the power to change the way people see the world and each other. Elizabeth Kennedy sat on the edge of a plush armchair in their Dallas hotel room, the city's skyline a faint glow through the window. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional ping of her phone still buzzing with notifications she hadn't checked. A plate of untouched room service, a chicken salad, and a glass of iced tea sat on the table beside her. John was downstairs in the hotel lobby making calls to his staff, ensuring the incident at Love Field wouldn't spiral into a political spectacle. Elizabeth didn't want that. She didn't want her face plastered across headlines or her story twisted into someone else's narrative. What she wanted was something harder to define, a way to make sense of what had happened. A way to ensure it meant something more than a viral moment. The television was off, but she could still picture the news segments, the grainy passenger videos, the captions calling her Senator Kennedy's wife. That label grated on her not because it wasn't true, but because it reduced her to a title when the real issue was about being human. She opened her phone, scrolling past the texts and emails until she found a link to one of the videos. Against her better judgment, she pressed play. The footage was familiar now, her standing at the counter, her voice steady as she asked about her seat, the TSA officers leading her away. But it was the comments that caught her off guard. Hundreds of them from people she'd never met. A single mother from Memphis wrote, "I was searched for 20 minutes because I looked suspicious. I missed my son's school play. Thank you for standing up." A truck driver from Oklahoma shared, "They treated my wife like this last year. No one cared because we're nobody. Keep fighting." A college student from Houston posted, "I saw this and cried. I've been there, and I didn't know how to speak up." Elizabeth set the phone down her throat, tight. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every person who'd been dismissed, overlooked, or made to feel small for no reason other than someone's whim. John returned to the room, loosening his tie as he closed the door. "Press is still calling," he said, his voice weary but calm. "I told them we're not doing interviews. Not yet." Elizabeth nodded, her eyes still on the window. "Good," she said softly. "I don't want this to be about us." John sat across from her, leaning forward, his hands clasped. "Then what do you want it to be about?" he asked. It was a simple question, but it carried weight. Elizabeth took a deep breath, her thoughts crystallizing. "It's about what happens when people forget that everyone deserves respect," she said. "Not because of who they're married to or what ID they carry, but because they're people. That's what they took from me at that counter, and that's what I want to give back." The incident at Love Field had sparked a conversation that neither Elizabeth nor John had anticipated. By the next morning, the airline had issued a second, more detailed apology, this time naming Elizabeth directly. We deeply regret the experience of Mrs. Elizabeth Kennedy at Dallas Love Field and are committed to ensuring all passengers are treated with dignity. It was better than the first attempt, but it still felt like a corporate script crafted to quiet the noise rather than address the root of the problem. The public wasn't satisfied. Social media posts continued to pour in with hashtags like #respect at the gate and no more excuses trending locally. A Dallas radio host dedicated an hour to the story, inviting callers to share their own airport experiences. The responses were overwhelming stories of humiliation, arbitrary searches, and missed flights, each one echoing Elizabeth's. It was clear now this wasn't an isolated incident. It was a pattern, one that had gone unnoticed until a senator's wife became the face of it. Elizabeth and John decided to use the moment not for personal gain, but to push for change. They met with a small group of community leaders in Dallas, including a local pastor and a civil rights advocate, to discuss how to turn the incident into a call for better training and accountability at airports. Elizabeth spoke at the meeting, her voice steady but passionate. "This isn't about one bad day at a gate," she said. "It's about a system that lets people be treated like problems instead of passengers. We can do better." The group agreed to draft a letter to Southwest's leadership, urging them to revise their staff training and implement clearer protocols for handling passenger inquiries. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a start, a way to channel the public's outrage into something constructive. The lesson of the incident, Elizabeth realized, was about more than just airport policies. It was about dignity as a fundamental right, not a privilege to be earned. She thought back to the gate agent Tyler and the way he'd smirked when she questioned him. It wasn't just about her, it was about a mindset that saw some people as less deserving of respect. That mindset wasn't unique to one counter or one airline. It was everywhere, in small moments that added up to a culture of indifference. Elizabeth wanted to change that, not with anger, but with awareness. She wrote a short, open letter later published in a local newspaper that captured her thoughts. Dignity isn't something you give someone because they have a title or a platform. It's what you owe every person, every time. When we forget that, we lose something as a society. Let's remember. The letter resonated, quoted widely online, and even read aloud on a morning talk show. It wasn't preachy or accusatory. It was a reminder, a call to look at the person in front of you and see them not a problem to be managed. Elizabeth and John heard from strangers who said the letter made them rethink their own interactions, whether as customers or employees. A gate agent from another airline emailed Elizabeth privately, admitting she'd been too quick to dismiss passengers in the past. "I'm going to do better," she wrote. "Thank you for making me see it." Those messages, more than the headlines, gave Elizabeth hope. Change didn't always come from big policies or loud protests. Sometimes it started with one person deciding to listen. As they prepared to return to Louisiana, Elizabeth stood in the hotel lobby, watching travelers stream through the revolving doors. Some were rushed, others relaxed, all of them carrying their own stories. She thought about her niece, who had understood why she missed the graduation party, but still sent a photo of herself in her cap and gown, smiling. "We'll celebrate when you're here, Aunt Liz," she'd written. That promise, small as it was, reminded Elizabeth why moments like these mattered, not for the drama, but for the connections they preserved. She turned to John, who was checking his phone nearby. "We did the right thing, didn't we?" she asked. He looked up, his expression softening. "You stood your ground without losing yourself," he said. "That's more than most could do." The lesson wasn't just for the airline or the public. It was for everyone who heard the story. Dignity isn't a reward for being important. It's a baseline, a starting point for how we treat each other. Elizabeth's experience showed what happens when that baseline is ignored, but also what's possible when people stand up, speak out, and demand better. The call to action was simple. Look people in the eye, listen to their questions, and treat them with the respect they're owed, whether they're a senator's wife or a stranger in line. Because how we handle those moments when no one's watching, or when everyone says everything about who we are. Elizabeth's story wasn't the end of the conversation. It was an invitation to keep it going, to make sure the next person at the counter doesn't have to fight to be seen.